Hello and welcome to this certification talk on Azure Fundamentals. We're going to provide some exam updates to everybody today.
Hi everyone, my name is Gregor and I live near Glasgow in Scotland. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP and also an Azure architect for a company called Intercept in the Netherlands. I've got about 24, 25 years experience, mainly as a kind of developer, VB6.net. And then I moved on to do an SRE role, and I've also been a development team manager. So I've got fairly varied background, but mostly in development. I'm currently certified in several Microsoft Azure exams, including the Solutions Architect Expert, the Administration Associate, and the DevOps Engineer Expert, and also the Security Engineer Associate. And I'm currently studying for the Azure Data Associate exam, which is the DP 200 and 201. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and I also help run the Glasgow Azure user group. And the best place to get a hold of me, if anyone has any questions, is pretty much on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is Gregor_Sutty. So that's a bit about me.
Thank you, Gregor. And my name is Dwayne Natwick. I am a cloud training architect lead at Opsagility. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, just like Gregor. I have served in many different roles, have many different Azure and Microsoft 365 role-based certifications. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer as well as a regional lead for the MCT program. And you can find me on the social media links on this slide. So what we're going to do in this next, roughly 45 minutes to an hour is there's been some updates to the Azure Fundamentals exam, and we want to kind of go through what has changed in terms of the exam objectives, what those changes are, some guidelines for preparing for the exam, and as well as some additional resources you might find helpful as you prepare for the Azure Fundamentals exam.
Yeah, so it's worth talking a lot about the exam objectives, and so there's kind of changes to the exam objectives, but let's talk about the fundamental exams first, Wayne. So the Azure Fundamentals exam, is one of six, I think there's 6 current fundamental exams, and they kind of provide a great overview and starting point to get certified in Microsoft technologies. So there's currently 6. This chat that we're having is about the Azure Fundamentals exam, but the other 5 are the Azure Data Fundamentals exam. Yeah, there's also the Azure AI, Security, Power Platform Fundamentals, and also the Dynamics 365. So there's currently 6, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be a few more coming out shortly. And the Fundamentals exam is kind of a great place to get started. So the fact that there's currently 6 is quite good. There's quite a lot of variance. So if you're a kind of data person, then start with the data fundamentals. If you're into Power Platform, then definitely start with that. And the same goes for the other ones, the security and the Dynamics 365. So I recommend that you start with the fundamentals exam. A lot of people might not have sat an exam for a short time, and they're not too tricky. They're definitely getting a little harder, which is good. I think that's why they're changing the exams, just to make them have a bit more up-to-date content. They're definitely slightly more challenging than they were at first. They're very good to get you started with a particular topic of interest. So definitely check out the 6 fundamentals exams, and some people have even sat the 6 fundamentals exams to start off with. So it's not a bad idea. So if we look at the exam objectives for the fundamentals exam, so we've got describe cloud concepts, describe core Azure services, describe core solutions and management tools on Azure, general security and network security features, describe identity governance, privacy, and compliance features, and last but not least is describe Azure cost management and service level agreements. So just by looking at that, you can see that there's 6 sections. There used to be only 4, I believe, if that's right, Dwayne?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so they've expanded the number of areas basically, and you can see the split here. So for example, the top one, describe cloud concepts, is now 20 to 25% of the overall exam. So I think these are probably good changes. You can see that they cover governance, cost management, service level agreements. So there's a lot of things to know. If you've never looked at Azure before, this is probably the very first exam I would recommend you look at. So these are pretty good exam objectives. Each section is broken down with kind of little sections within each one, and they give you on the official exam page, they kind of show you what you need to know and what you're going to be asked upon. My recommendation is looking at Microsoft Learn, going to the official exam page, reading this. You can download a PDF document with all the latest changes for the exam. I think it was updated around about November the 9th, I think it was. So yeah, definitely check that out. Check out what you're going to be asked about. You're going to have to go off and find out and try and learn this kind of stuff. And I tend to find that the content that they ask you in each exam, you can find on Microsoft Learn or the Microsoft Docs. But Microsoft Learn is a great place to go and start and kind of look at the stuff you need to know.
Yeah, thank you, Gregor. Yeah, let's go a little bit deeper into some of these changes regarding those objective areas. So as Gregor had stated, they had originally announced back in August that they were going to make some changes, and then delayed those changes to November 9th, as Gregor said. And one of the key things that Gregor pointed out in that previous slide was that the objective areas and the weighted percentages, there were some significant changes around how that was structured. And so to kind of expand upon that objective area slide and talk a little bit more about these changes. As Gregor stated, there were 4 sections previously. There was Cloud Concepts, Core Azure Services, Security, Privacy, Compliance, and Trust were all in one section previously, and then Cost Management and Service Level Agreements were also within the original objectives. They took the Core Azure Services and the Security, Privacy, and Compliance sections and built those into 2 separate sections. So there's a Core Azure Services section still, but that is mostly, and we'll talk about a little bit further detail in a moment, that is mostly around the virtual machines and the core like networking type services. And then they took and created a core solutions and management tools as its own section as well. So they kind of split the 30 to 35% 2 ways, and a lot of those core solutions and management tools take more of a look at a lot of the platform services and microservices rather than and not think of it in terms of the compute services. And then again, with the Security, Privacy, Compliance, and Trust, which was a 25 to 30% section, they broke that out into 2 sections. That's security and networking, specific security features as well as network security features, and then identity governance, privacy, and compliance in its own section as well. And you can see that piece itself around identity governance and compliance actually is close to the same percentage of the previous section was itself, and then the security and network security is a little bit lower requirement in terms of the weighted value of things. It's and that to a degree is a great way of breaking it out, because I think some people will get a little bit confused. There's a little bit of confusion here and there regarding governance and compliance versus security, and they really are 2 separate types of roles that you can think about. Compliance and governance and privacy go in a very different direction than specific security and building your security approach within your organization. And then they decreased to accommodate some of these new sections and the percentages and weighted values of those. They actually decreased the cost management and service level agreements from a 20 to 25, from being about a quarter of the exam to only about 10 to 15%, which I think is again a good change, because previously you spent a lot of time understanding service level agreements and composite service level agreements and different things in terms of Azure Advisor and costing and things like that. But from a fundamental standpoint, understanding it at a high level is probably is plenty for you. And as you're going down the path of administering in Azure, you get a lot deeper into that, as well as, your role and the role direction you go in. It's good to know it at a high level, but don't, knowing all of that at a really deep, granular level isn't important at a fundamentals portion of the exam, which, a lot of times, at a fundamental, taking a fundamentals exam, as Gregor said, it's a great starting point for going down your Azure path, as well as, for sellers within a organization, like a CSP partner, for example. Everybody should really have a fundamental understanding around Azure, and this exam does that exact piece to help you out. So let's talk about each of these a little bit more in depth in terms of what those changes are, and going through each of the areas within the concepts. So the first objective area is cloud concepts, and cloud concepts from a standpoint of a fundamentals exam is very detailed within the Azure Fundamentals exam, which is a great thing, because it being a fundamentals exam and being really that starter exam, understanding the concepts of the cloud is important before you start getting into even the Azure technologies. And this goes along with any cloud provider that you might be utilizing, whether it's AWS or Google Cloud platform, or any other cloud that's out there. You need to understand those concepts, and the concepts cloud to cloud are relatively the same from a standpoint of what is within the Azure Fundamentals exam. So it gives you that base, it gives you that foundation that you need as you start then moving forward more in understanding Microsoft Azure. And some of the key components and key areas that were added was they went into a lot. They've gone into a lot more detail around shared responsibility model. It was a quick mention in the previous content, but they went a lot deeper into understanding and building on what that is, and that goes along with the defining cloud computing and understanding what a infrastructure as a service, a platform as a service, and a software as a service cloud services are, and where responsibility lies between the cloud provider, being in Azure's case Microsoft, and the consumer, the customer, or the CSP, in what they're supporting. And so understanding that is foundational to how you're going to manage, how you need to understand what Microsoft is responsible for within their service level agreements, and how that all works out for you. So a very important piece there. They've also expanded more on serverless computing, because that's becoming more and more of a driver for organizations to move to the cloud, is utilizing those services that are no longer based on that infrastructure piece, where you're now just building infrastructure as code, or building code on containers and Kubernetes clusters and things like that. And those are becoming more and more of a focus and a driver for transforming your organization to the cloud. So there's some more discussion in cloud concepts in terms of what serverless computing is, and defining that for you, where that was not something that was brought up too much before. It was more of a passing and necessarily an assumption around platform services, where it's becoming more and more of its own area. The different use cases, and then the different definitions. One of the things around cloud computing definitions is they've kind of moved away from even discussing like community cloud, where that's more of a private kind of hybrid cloud type environment, and really they're focusing more on the typical public, private, and hybrid cloud in terms of defining cloud computing and what cloud computing is. And they've taken a little bit of pieces out around fault tolerance, economies of scale, and not so much comparing and contrasting the cloud services types, but just understanding those three types rather than really comparing and contrasting. You really just need to understand what each is, and where the responsibility model lies. They all work together, and they all are part of the same, all part of that cloud ecosystem. And then once we understand our cloud concepts, obviously then we can start moving into the Azure services. And so quite a few changes in here, where they've added some things around express route and the different storage tiers, which is actually fairly new in terms of the flexibility in creating your storage tiers and your data lifecycle management within storage tiers. Containers has been added, which previously was not much of a talking point within the core services within Azure, but it's becoming, as I said, more and more important as a driver into cloud services, and as well as SQL managed instances, database services, and moving to a managed SQL service to help limit and decrease your overhead within an organization. Is becoming more and more important, and becoming more and more, again, a driver for moving workloads into the Azure environment. So that has come more to the forefront in terms of what Microsoft sees as core services. So therefore, has moved that. They've taken away some of the conversations around some of the higher level services and more detailed services that really fall into more of the associate and expert type exams, such as virtual machine scale sets, application gateways. Archive storage falls into that storage tier conversation, so they didn't really necessarily remove it, but it's not really its own topic anymore. And then like database migration services is another piece that has kind of been moved out and emphasized in terms of this in terms of the exam for fundamentals. You get really deep and detailed into these when you start going into, say, the administrator associate exams and the architect expert exams. You get a lot more detail in terms of those. So I think, Gregor, you're going to talk a little bit about the core solutions and management tools, which this one has a lot to take into account because it's a new section.
Yeah, so the core solutions and management tools. So this is a new section that's broken out from being in the core Azure services previously, which is what you just touched on. So they've added Azure Sphere, which is kind of like an IoT security solution. They've added Azure Synapse Analytics. So that's had a name change. That used to be Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and there was a big announcement just only yesterday. Azure Synapse itself has now went GA. So Azure Synapse is kind of like the new data warehouse for Azure, basically. It does a number of things, but that very high level, it's the new data warehouse, database warehouse tool for Azure, basically. They've also mentioned and added GitHub and GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions is kind of like it's a bit like Azure DevOps pipelines. They've moved that into the exam, and so you need to know a little bit about GitHub. So GitHub's kind of where you hold the repositories for your source code. So that's kind of where open source developers host their code. And Microsoft bought GitHub not that long ago, and have 50+ million developers in GitHub. So that's kind of why they want to talk about that. Like GitHub Actions is basically you can create workflows that kind of build code, test code. You can use it to deploy to production. You can do a number of things using GitHub Actions. And if you're familiar at all with Azure DevOps, it's kind of like GitHub's version of building and testing, scanning code for viruses, scanning code for malicious code, and things like that. So GitHub Actions is worth having a look at as well. And it's nice to see that they've added that in. They've also added in, let's look at another one, ARM templates. So ARM templates are Azure Resource Management templates. So if you go into the Azure portal and you basically create any resource, what it's doing behind the scenes is it's using an ARM template to deploy the resources to Azure. So you can actually deploy, let's say a storage account, and before you deploy it, you get the chance to view the ARM template. So it's a kind of JSON file structure. and they ask you a little bit about the structure of an ARM template and what do you use them for. So just to recap, you use ARM templates to deploy different types of Azure resources. You have a main deployment file and a parameter deployment file. So you could say deploy a virtual machine to Azure using this template, and then you can pass in different parameters to deploy the different parameters. You might deploy the same virtual machine to different regions, for example. They also brought in Azure Monitor and Azure Service Health, which I think is really good additions, because you need to know when you put something into Azure and you've got it running in production, you want to have a look in and see what's happening. So Azure Monitor is very good at giving you as a developer or as someone kind of monitoring your Azure resources, you can go in and see what's happening and monitor it basically. So Azure Monitor and Azure Service Health are pretty good additions. And on the right-hand side, they've moved Event Grid. So I reckon they've moved Event Grid out of there because it's kind of more an Azure service that you would use and probably more relevant to the developer exams, to be honest. So that's kind of the core solutions and management tools update. So some good additions, and probably good that they've removed Event Grid. For a fundamental exam, you don't really need to know too much about what Event Grid does, and that's more a developer type exam question topic. And then after that, we have security and network security features. So they haven't removed anything, which is interesting. And they've brought in expanded Azure Security Center. So Azure Security Center is kind of the one-stop shop for security within the Azure portal. So lots of our customers, we deploy resources, and they always want to know, how do we look after security? So Security Center is kind of like the one-stop shop for checking that and basically making sure that everything has been, everything that's running in Azure is secure. They've also brought in Azure Sentinel and Defense in Depth. So they're trying to add security topics to the AZ-900 Fundamentals exam, which I think is an important point. And this section was broken out from security, privacy, compliance, and trust. So they've kind of brought that in and split it out a little bit. So these are welcome additions, I would say. Azure Security Center is definitely a good thing to know about. If you're kind of like a salesperson working for a CSP or something like that, you might be on calls and get asked about how do we know that everything's secure. So as a CSP, we can log into the Azure Security Center and basically inform our customers that everything's running well and looking good. So yeah, nothing's been removed, which is good. But that's kind of the high-level overview of security and network security features for the AZ-900.
Yeah, and so and one of the nice things as well about that is the fact that they brought in kind of that defense in depth thought process into the exam as well. From a fundamental standpoint, again, goes back to like the shared responsibility model, understanding some of those core things to think about as you're going through and you're talking to a client, or you're an organization looking at the cloud. Understanding some of these core concepts is really what's important around these fundamentals exams, is getting that, is building that base, and then you can move in more into those role-based features. And that goes along again with the second piece that kind of came out of that security, privacy, compliance, and trust grouping previously, and that's identity, governance, privacy, and compliance. And a lot of different changes around this, specifically because around identity. And one of the things around identity is conditional access and multi-factor authentication and things like that around identity. Identity is becoming more and more of a important piece as you move into the cloud, and as you think about the shared responsibility, that it becomes the primary area of which and kind of that perimeter piece of security, and really the foundational piece of security in how you're building your role-based access controls, and you're building your who has access to what, and when, and protecting from bad actors coming into your and gaining access into your organization through the cloud. Then another piece on here is the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure, which again is another one of those foundational overarching pieces that go into thinking about your migration to the cloud and how you're going about taking workloads and either refactoring them, transforming them. Are you just doing a lift and shift of workloads into Azure? That Cloud Adoption Framework helps to determine and think about all the planning and everything that needs to go along with that, and then how you continue down that journey into Azure and moving more and more workloads into Azure, and then how your organization then is monitoring and managing those, as well as reevaluating and doing improvements as you go about it. So having those pieces in there are very important. Data protection, again, another piece around governance, how we're protecting and governing our data is another important approach when we're thinking about governance, as well as the different sovereign regions within the Azure environment. Previously, Azure Germany kind of had its own area around these sovereign regions. The focus has changed to talking more about Azure China and how that differs from a typical region within the UK or Europe or the Americas, being built in its own sovereign data center within the country that maintains the control of that data within that country. And Germany and Russia are two other sovereign regions as well that are talked about within the fundamentals exam, and just understanding those and understanding some of the requirements around compliance, around like GDPR compliance for data protection, and different compliances such as NIST in the United States, and HIPAA and PCI and a lot of those, some of ISO 27001. Those are all brought up and discussed at a high level, but are all part of those compliance pieces. They removed the Service Trust Portal out of the fundamentals exam. As Gregor was saying, they expanded upon the Azure Security Center quite substantially in the discussion, and really Service Trust Portal and Azure Security Center does a lot of the same things that Service Trust Portal does. So I think they de-emphasize that one, because you get a certain level of the same Service Trust Portal things that you get within both Azure Security Center as well as Azure Advisor, which is still also a piece that's within the exam criteria. And then the final objective, this is one that probably had more de-emphasis on things than on areas than it did in the past, where some of the things that were added that weren't really talked about a whole lot were reserved instances and reserved capacity, and how that can help an organization decrease their costs within their Azure consumption, as well as the hybrid use benefit, utilizing your enterprise agreements and software assurance agreements within the Azure environment to bring Windows Server licensing and SQL licensing into the Azure environment and decrease your costs rather than having to pay for those again, is helpful within there. And then the different life cycles, talking about Gregor mentioned Azure Synapse being in general availability. Talking through what private preview is, public preview, and general availability, and how a life cycle goes in terms of a new service being available within Azure is another area of understanding that at a high level you just need to understand what the differences are between the three pieces and what they who has access to what. And then they took some of the pieces out around Azure subscriptions and management groups, where management groups really mostly pertain only to like enterprise agreements. So I think they were going for more of an overarching approach with consumption within Azure and subscriptions within Azure, where management groups don't really pertain to everybody. They only pertain to like the higher echelon, enterprise level, fortune level type organizations. And then they took out some things around building zones and, like I mentioned, composite SLAs and how to calculate those, which really don't a lot of times don't really come into play a whole lot. Understanding just what a service level agreement is at a fundamentals level adequate to everybody. So Gregor, you want to talk about some pointers around preparing for taking the Azure Fundamentals exam?
Yep. So I'm actually preparing to study for an exam just now, so it's quite relevant. So to prepare for the exam, the number one thing I would say is go to the exam official webpage, start off there, download the objectives, read up on the exam, figure out if it's your first exam, figure out what you need to know, read out how you go about booking the exam, things like that. But I think it's also important to create a study plan. So choose your path, basically. Start off with what exam are you going to kind of go for first. Obviously, this is the AZ-900, so we're starting off with the fundamentals. So it's important to create a study plan. So when I was studying for these exams, I tend to create a study plan of roughly 2 hours a night, or 2 hours a day. Not everyone can do that. I totally accept that. Not everyone's got the spare time that I do. But you can try and make the time if it's important to you. So you might be able to get up early and do an hour, or maybe do an hour during your lunch, maybe try and fit in an hour at night. But I tend to try and do 2 hours a night, every night, just to try and keep it going. I tend to find that if I study for something and I have a gap, I kind of forget what I've learned before. So it's important to have a plan and try and stick to that. The plan is basically get some time, put some time aside, take some notes. I usually use OneNote and I write down all the objectives and I kind of go through them one by one. It's important to have a plan because otherwise you just spend a lot of time kind of without a goal and you soon realise you're not really getting anywhere. So if you take the objectives for the exam and you write them down, you set aside time to focus on your learning. I also recommend try and use some hands-on labs for some of the exams. Use the portal. If you don't know what an SLA is, go and read up on it. So yeah, try and spend some time on the portal, hands-on labs. You can also use practice tests to aid your study. The good thing about some of the practice tests is if you don't know the answer, they normally send you a link to read up on, which is good. So yeah, that's kind of my tips for preparing for an exam. The other thing I normally do is I try and book the exam in advance. So if it's your very first exam, then maybe book the exam in a month's time, and then that will help you focus. Yeah, so that's kind of my study plan. So the other thing we wanted to talk about is Microsoft Learn. So Microsoft Learn is basically Microsoft's free platform for structured learning. There's kind of 3 main sections that allow you to start your training plan. There's learning paths, certifications, and docs. The learning paths can take you directly into the content of Microsoft Learn. So you can actually go in and choose the exam, and within Microsoft Learn, it will show you links to the content that will help you pass the exam. So there's kind of like courses. There's courses and modules. Learning paths is what they're called. So you can choose the AZ-900 Fundamentals learning path. I think there's like 4 or 5 sections to that, and that'll cover pretty much anything you'll get asked in the exam. So if you're wanting to find a specific area to study and gain knowledge, this section can take you to a place where you can search and filter what you need. So that's one of the best places to go is Microsoft Learn.
Yeah, we can show. Let's show that actually, Gregor.
Do you want me to do it, or do you want to do that?
I've got it right here, just
okay.
Pulling up right now. So here, if you go, one of the nice things, if you go right into and browse your certifications,
yeah,
and we can take you here and do, you can do any of the exams. We'll do AZ-900, and you can go right in here. And if you scroll down, we can see our skills measured. So this is our objective areas. There's a structured outline that goes through everything that we're discussing today as well. But the key thing around Azure Microsoft Learn is, you have the learning paths right here, and you can see there's 5 parts to the Azure Fundamentals exam. in a lot of cases for the fundamentals exam, these modules are a lot of times between this and going back and reviewing like the Microsoft Docs, a lot of times mainly what you need for passing these fundamentals exams. I wouldn't recommend it for the associate and the expert exams. That gives you a good start, but you would need probably some other parts to preparing for those exams. But from a fundamentals exam where it's excuse me, very high level, for the most part, these are really good modules around that. And if you go into a module, you can very easily see the different pieces of it, and it goes through and even does a knowledge check at the end. But there's also videos within embedded within a lot of these as well as some of the more detailed ones might have even a cloud sandbox that you can run through a particular exercise within Azure. So really helpful there. Anything you want to add, Greg?
Yeah, if you go back, the thing that I really like about Microsoft Learn is if I'm kind of looking for information about a specific Azure subject or a specific Azure product, I can just go and search for that and find it. So these are kind of like bite-sized learning. So the thing about the paths are, it also tells you roughly how long it will take you to complete. So some of these are maybe like 15, 20 minutes. So yeah, if you look for like virtual machines and you want to know about virtual VMs,
because I'm not.
Oh, you're in search. So if you go to the courses and then you search for like virtual machines, what that's going to show you is so these are kind of small modules that you can go and learn on. Basically, you can go and learn about products as well. Yeah, I think it's still on certifications. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in instructor-led courses somehow. Okay.
Yeah, you can go to like products and search for products, or you can go and learn for roles as well. So basically, to recap, Microsoft Learn is very good for finding specific bite-sized bits of information on roles, products. You've also got the exams. You've got courses and modules. So like you can do a small module on like Introduction to Azure Virtual Machines, the one in the middle there. So that's like 1 hour, 7 minutes, and it gives you the learning objectives you're going to learn. You can bookmark it. You can add it to a collection. It kind of tells you like the level, so it's like a beginner course. So you can filter the courses on kind of like beginner, intermediate, expert, and you basically just go through it. And you'll also notice that you get a wee score as well, so you can keep score as you're going. And at the end of most of these courses, you get like a knowledge check. And if you get them all right, then you get a better score than you do if you get a couple wrong. So yeah, so you can go in here and do a knowledge check. So Microsoft Learn is a brilliant resource. Now, the one thing I wanted to stress is it's always getting updated. So things like Synapse got released yesterday. I'm pretty sure you can search for Synapse. So you need to keep coming back to Microsoft Learn because it's always getting updated. Once the exams get updated, there you go. So implement a data warehouse with Azure Synapse Analytics. 2 hours, 53 minutes. So some of the courses are quite short. Some of the courses are quite long. You can dip in and dip out. You don't need to kind of complete them. Some of them have sandbox, as you say, which basically means it creates an Azure container in the background, and you can basically get a link to the portal, and it's all free. You can spin up resources, play around with like virtual machine sizing, stuff like that. So really good resource, Microsoft Learn. It's a kind of thing that people look at and then forget about and don't use that often, but I pretty much use it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first places I go to when I'm doing an exam.
Exactly. Yep. Great starting point.
Yeah.
And so that gets us to resources, which we hit on mainly the most part, and the Microsoft Docs falls right into that same section here. If we go into documentation, that puts us right into Microsoft Docs, and you can very easily, from a standpoint of any piece of the objectives, you can really just search and find specific documentation on any of that. You can, if I want to find Azure Security Center, I can go in here and find everything I need to know on Security Center. What is Azure Security Center? And it brings you into these documents and these document pages that can take you through everything you need to know in terms of what it does, at an overview level, and then gets really deep and detailed in terms of concepts and tutorials of how you plan and operate within Azure Security Center, different how-to guides of how to use the dashboards and things like that. And this structure is similar and templatized across any service within Azure, Microsoft 365, Dynamics, Power Platform, any of the services within Microsoft. So it's really helpful from that standpoint. Azure Architect Center is another piece within it's within Microsoft Docs as well, and it provides you with diagrams around Azure and provides with icons and different architectures and overviews within the environment, just to get an idea how certain services go together and how they work, and what they look like in terms of in different types of scenarios. So if you're an organization that's moving into Azure and looking at can we utilize this service for this? You can utilize this as kind of best practice frameworks for a lot of things. Hands-on labs, as Gregor and I both said, you can find some of this within Microsoft Learn, as well as there's a lot of learning providers. My company Skill Me Up does a lot of building of our own hands-on labs around every one of these courses. So study guides. Gregor does a great job of putting study guides together when he prepares for an exam and sharing those with the community. So go out to Azure Greg and find his study guides there, and those generally help you help decrease your time to search for different docs and things like that as well. And there's a lot of different ones out there, community members that do a lot of study guides around different exams. And then the exam page, which is what I started on to begin with. You can go out to Microsoft Learn, browse exams, find any exam and go to that exam page, find those objectives, understand what those objectives are, and go from there. And Azure Fundamentals, again, has as well the Microsoft Learn courses all embedded there. So it's a great starting point to, and really a great landing page for you to start your direction and your training. And then once you've gone through and taken on that certification, hitting the fundamental certification, you might want to go a little bit further, and this kind of takes you down the different paths that you might take from there. From all of the fundamentals pieces, there's fundamentals pieces in each one of these buckets, each one of these silos and these areas. And then you might want to start going further down and picking specific roles. As Gregor was saying, he's working on the data engineering associate here, the DP 200 and 201, and it lets you know how many exams you need to pass and take to get each one of these certifications as you go down there, and determine where you're going. Are you more of an administrator or infrastructure person? You might want to go down the admin or the solution architect expert. If you're a developer, you might want to go down the developer associate. Key thing here as well is that, see, like the DevOps engineer expert, there's a star here that's really saying that there's a prerequisite to getting that exam, which the prerequisite to that is either the 104 or the 204. So you can always go to the exam pages and identify whether there's any prerequisites and what your path is as well, and you can go from there.
The one thing I would add to that is you don't actually need to follow the path. You can actually jump around. So you don't actually, for example, the AZ-900, the DevOps expert. Some people have just sat that exam without doing the one before it. So you're not really restricted in what you do in the order. Don't get me wrong, you should start with the fundamentals, then do the associate, then do the expert. But you don't have to do that as well. And one other thing I wanted to just mention is the hands-on labs. So hands-on labs for me is the best way for me to learn. I always associate it, like if I was wanting to learn to fly a plane, I wouldn't read a book on learning how to fly a plane. I need to get behind the controls and spend time in the cockpit. Hence why the pilots have got to book loads and thousands of hours in the plane. So for me, my best tip for learning is do as many hands-on labs as you can. Even if it's the fundamentals, still do hands-on labs. Just they'll teach you things you didn't think about, and you can you can break it. You can try something different. You can click on the wrong thing and it'll break, and then try it again. And you can throw the hands-on labs away. It doesn't cost you any money. So yeah, I just wanted to stress the hands-on labs is kind of the number one. That's the number one thing I like to do. I'm going to be doing the DP exams, and I'm going to be doing hands-on learning SQL Server stuff.
Especially when you start getting the associate and the expert type exams. You know, fundamentals you can get away with, but it's nice to get a little bit of hands-on just to help you with comprehending some of the components and the services and understanding the portal a bit. But once you get into the associate and the expert exams, getting some real hands-on pieces help you when you take those exams and help you understand things. And like Gregor said, that was a really good point. All of these exams stand alone on themselves. So none of them really, they might build on each other a little bit, but they really are meant to just, based on what your role is and what you want to do, take you down that road. If you're more of a conceptual design type person, that's when you're thinking about the two exams for data engineer and solution architect expert, you might be better suited taking the listed second exam in number sequence first, rather than taking the other one, which is more of an administrative piece, because you might need more hands-on from that standpoint rather than conceptual case study type knowledge. And that's really something really great that I really like about how Microsoft went and structured these role-based exams a couple of years ago was they stand on their own. And there's some overlaps. You might find overlaps in different areas from one exam to another because they're meant to stand alone, and they're meant to, the objectives are meant for that specific role, not necessarily for that specific exam. They're looking at that role, and if somebody needs to be a security engineer within their organization for Azure, what do they need to know as that fundamental knowledge and that basic knowledge to be able to perform that job duty? And that's really, really helpful as you go through building your path to certifications.
Yeah, the one thing I would just like to add to that is people ask me quite regularly, what is the exam to start with? And I would always say the AZ-900. No matter what level you're at, if you're a beginner in Azure or an expert in Azure and you're doing your first exam, start off with the fundamentals, because it's kind of gently kind of puts you in the exam frames. You have to remember that a lot of people might not have studied for a while.
Yeah. The fundamentals exam get you familiar with the Microsoft exams. It's it's a little more than half the cost of an associate or an expert exam.
Which is a good point.
It doesn't cost you as much. It's usually around $100 US versus closer to $165, $170 US for an associate or an expert exam. So those, the exam cost is much easier to bear, and it gets you familiar with how questions are asked within a Microsoft exam, as well as it gets you started. It's a good start. I'm right with you, Gregor. I've taken every fundamentals exam that there is, with the exception of the dynamics, just because I don't get involved in CRM at all. So I never, didn't plan on going any further down any of those paths, but the other ones have all been helpful in just getting you base knowledge, especially because when you talk about Azure and Microsoft 365 and Power Platform, they all there's all pieces and functions that intertwine, and like even the AI and the data, those are all pieces that intertwine within the services, within every other service within each of these key exam areas. So that brings us to the end of this update. So hopefully you found this helpful. We covered a lot of the changes in the exam objectives and what you need to know at a high level in terms of what's new with the Azure Fundamentals exam. And then we hopefully provided some really key key information to help you get prepared for your exam and start down your path to getting the Azure Fundamentals exam. And then, then the resources that are then available for that Fundamentals exam, as well as any direction that you want to take after that. So I want to thank you very much for attending this certification talk on the Azure Fundamentals update. My name is Dwayne Natwick.
My name is Gregor, and if you're sitting the exam, all the best and good luck.
Yes, and these certification talks, as well as our Cloud Maker and Thinking Cloudy and Cloud Native talks, are all available usually a couple weeks after the live event are available on the Skill Me Up YouTube channel, as well as skillmeup.com. So feel free to visit those for past recorded live events, as well as go to skillmeup.com for the full schedule of any upcoming expert talks that we have coming up, around our certification talks. We also do some more technical talks on Cloud Native, and Cloud Maker type areas on Azure 365, Power Platform, and Dynamics across our Skill Me Up page. So thank you very much, and have a great day.